Well, good morning. Let me see if I can get a little organized up here. This is a wee bit, I feel a wee bit like David with Saul's armor up here. Now that I'm back on the stage with the big screen, so hopefully I'll get over that feeling, but I feel like I'm in the wrong place for some reason. But welcome back to the book of Acts. The goal will be to get through the first 36 verses of chapter 7. This is lesson 11. The rejected ones become the rulers and deliverers. That's going to be one of Stephen's threads. So last week we saw the internal problems that happened in the early church, in particular with this point. Some of the Hellenists were concerned that their widows were being mistreated, or at least not treated the same as the Hebrew widows as it related to the daily distribution of food and what could have been money. Now, this was a serious issue that had the chance to divide the church. It had the chance to split the church between Hebrew and Hellenist. But the apostles, understanding the seriousness of the charge, you remember they gave directions to the congregation, to the believers. There were essentially, they said, pick out 7, and then they gave 5 requirements or 5 really qualifications for those. They were to be men. They were to be men that came out from among the group. They were to be men filled with wisdom in the Holy Spirit. Now, again, I told you many believe those are the earliest deacons. This is the first deacons in the Church of Jesus Christ, but not everyone believes that. So it's definitely not a hill anybody needs to die on. But again, many believe that these were the first deacons. I told you 5 of those men went off into history, never to be named in the Bible again. They just passed along. No doubt they executed their office well. This was principally an administrative office. But 2 of these men come back around in the scriptures, Stephen and Philip. These are men who, as you're going to see, are not only filled with the Spirit of God and filled with wisdom, but they are men who have a profound understanding of the scriptures. They're men who understand the Old Testament and its connection into Jesus, the Messiah. And so this morning we come back to that first one, back to Stephen. Now, if you remember, Stephen had been preaching and declaring Jesus Christ. No doubt that he was the Messiah. No doubt that the nation of Israel had killed the Messiah. He was declaring these things. And we're told that men from multiple synagogues, as many as 5, but at least 3, depending on how you do the names, but these men from multiple synagogues, likely all Hellenists like him, begin to dispute with Stephen. They began to argue with Stephen. As Stephen presented biblical evidence that Jesus was the Messiah, as Stephen presented proof on who Jesus was from the Hebrew scriptures, they begin to dispute and begin to argue. And then we're told this, but these men from these various synagogues could not withstand the wisdom in the spirit with which he was speaking. He brought forth all these biblical arguments and biblical proofs and biblical evidence of Jesus that he was indeed the promised Messiah, and they could not refute. They could not overthrow. They could not argue against his biblical logic. Now, at this point, Nan, you would think, what's going to happen? They're all going to place faith in Jesus Christ. He's proven that Jesus is the Messiah. They can bring no evidence to the contrary, and they're all going to repent and become part of the 20,000 or more that have joined the church by this time. That's not what Luke records. Then that's these Hellenists, some of these men from these synagogues, some of these men who are disputing with Stephen. By the way, among these men was more than likely, almost certainly, a man named Saul. Among these men who could not overthrow what Stephen was saying was the great Pharisee, a man named Saul, who we know as Paul. But they secretly, because they couldn't overthrow his logic, some of the men there, no doubt not all of them, but some, instigated men. They purchased men. They paid men to lie. They couldn't overthrow the biblical logic of what he was saying. So they, rather than said, oh, we've heard him, Stephen, speak blasphemous words against Moses and against God. They couldn't overthrow his biblical logic, so what did they do? They attacked the person himself. They said he's a blasphemer. He speaks blasphemous words against Moses. He speaks blasphemous words against God. He speaks blasphemous words against the temple. He speaks blasphemous words against the law. That's what they said. All of them untrue, but it riled up everyone in the crowd. They seized him. They brought him before the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin leveled those 4 charges against him, and we ended last week with the high priest Caiaphas standing up and saying, if we're to shift to modern vernacular, what do you have to say for yourself against these charges? That's where we ended last week. Stephen, the deacon, he's not an apostle, he's a deacon, standing before 71 of the most powerful men he will ever interact with in his life. They've leveled charges against him. They've stripped him apart, and he's now going to respond. And that's where we ended last week. In your notes, you have a 14-point outline of the first 36 verses. It's a busy text this morning as Stephen walks through the history of the nation of Israel. Now, he's doing this. The Sanhedrin don't need a history lesson. They fully understand the history of Israel. But we can forget important things. We can forget important lessons from history. And what Stephen is going to do is remind the Sanhedrin of some important points of history that they either willfully or whatever unknowingly forgot. Now, before expounding the sermon, I want to give you 7 observations in advance, and then I have 8 at the end. The primary issue up till now has been the resurrection from the dead. And the primary people standing against the early church have been the group called the Sadducees, whoever said it, because they did not believe in a resurrection, and these apostles are preaching the resurrection. The high priest is a Sadducee. We remember they responded. So the primary issue up until now has been principally the Sadducees. Today we're going to involve the Pharisees as well. Point number 2, it is likely, almost 100%, that Saul was among these men. The great mind Saul could not refute the wisdom, the biblical wisdom of this young deacon named Stephen. Now, why is that? Because it's the truth and because he's filled with the Spirit of God. Number 3, what's interesting, this is the longest sermon recorded in Acts. This is not a sermon preached by Peter or Paul. This is a sermon preached by a deacon to a hostile audience. He had no notes. He didn't have a nice notebook like I have. He didn't have PowerPoint slides already prepared that he could talk about. He is going to walk through a detailed and accurate understanding of the history of the nation of Israel, and more significantly, how that history connects to the Messiah. And he does so totally unprepared for this event. They seize him, they drag him, and he records the longest sermon we have in the book of Acts. In this sermon, point number 4, he shows not only a profound understanding of the Old Testament. You'll see that. He's quoting from the Septuagint. Again, he was a Hellenist. He was a Greek speaker. His name is Greek. And he's quoting from the Greek version of the Old Testament. He has a detailed knowledge of the Bible. But I would say this, what we're going to learn is the apostles have trained him well. We don't know when he came into the equation, but he is a man who has a handle on the Old Testament, and he is now able to connect it to the Lord Jesus Christ. Point 5, this begins a whole new round of persecution, much more serious than any of the persecution up till now. Up till now, what has happened at the worst is people have been beaten. There's no recording of anyone dying. At the end of his sermon next week, he will be killed. In fact, he won't get to end his sermon. They will stop their ears, they will run up on him, they will drag him out, and they will murder him. So much for following the law. Number 6, I would remind us, God can use the worst of events, in this case, persecution, in the killing of an innocent man for his good and for his glory. Romans 8:28 and 29 is always true. All things indeed work together for good to those who love him, to those who are called according to his purpose. And even in persecution, God is going to use that persecution to move all these freshly trained disciples, again, that word means learner, all these freshly trained learners across the Roman Empire with the gospel of Jesus Christ. As they flee, they're telling people about Jesus. And God uses something that man intended for bad to still get good from it. And then point number 7, again, we should not be surprised. He quotes from the Septuagint. He is indeed a Greek speaker. We're set. Stephen is before the Sanhedrin. The high priest has risen up and said, are these things so? And that's where we pick up. Any questions? The stage is set before we get running our text this morning. Okay, the rejected ones become the rulers and deliverers. Verse 1. By the way, totally unrelated to lesson. Next week, I'll move this up a little bit. I suspect the folks in the back are probably doing this back there. We'll get that fixed. So forgive me for that. We were not sure if the projector was going to fully work, so we just left it the old way, but I'll move that up a little bit so heads are not blocking. Verse 1. And the high priest said, Are these things so? We've already talked about this. This is where we ended last week. They've leveled the 4 charges in summation. What they've said is he's speaking blasphemous words against Moses and against God. He's speaking blasphemous words against the law and against the temple. They've leveled the charges. Then Caiaphas, the high priest at the time, stands up. He is the son-in-law of Annas, the outgoing priest. But right now, the high priest until 36 AD will be Caiaphas. He is a Sadducee. We've talked about that before. But he is the one who stands up and says, What do you have to say for yourself? Verse 2. And Stephen said, Brothers and fathers, hear me. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia before he lived in Haran, and said to him, Go out from your land, from your kindred, and go into the land that I will show you. Now I want you to put yourself in Stephen's shoes. He's not Stephen the apostle, he's Stephen the deacon. Here he is before the 71 most powerful men in the nation of Israel who've called him blasphemers, who've attacked his character, who said he's a blasphemer against God, he's a blasphemer against Moses, he's a blasphemer against the law of God, he even blasphemes the temple. I don't know how you would respond to the 71 most powerful men, but here's how he responds. He begins with brothers and fathers. He is very respectful. He shows deference for who they are. He understands he's standing before the Sanhedrin. He understands he's standing before this powerful body, and he shows them respect in spite of the fact they're showing him no respect. In spite of the fact they're slandering him, he is very respectful. And he addresses them as fathers, brothers and fathers, hear me. Then he says this, the God of glory appeared to our father Abraham. Now, this phrase, God of glory, is only recorded in the New Testament here. No one else in the New Testament refers to God this way, as the God of glory. Now, Stephen didn't dream this up. It actually came from David. David is the one who used this term to speak of Yahweh as the God of glory. This is Psalm 29:3. The voice of Yahweh is over the waters. The God of glory thunders. And Stephen grabs that title of Yahweh and brings it forward and addresses the Sanhedrin. The God of glory stepped in and appeared to Abraham. MacArthur in his commentary, and Rich, I don't know if you guys discussed this when you were with him, but at any rate, the title appears only here and in Psalm 29:3. It is the most rich, complete description of the Almighty, holy, sovereign God, since his glory is the composite of his attributes. He is the all-glorious one. Does this sound like a blasphemer of God? This sounds like a man who understands the Bible and who understands who God is. And he opens up with saying, the God of glory appeared to Abraham while he was in Mesopotamia. So let's pause there. Mesopotamia is this area, the Ur of Chaldees, and get his point. They've been all fired up about and accusing him of speaking blasphemous words against the temple. And he's reminding them, don't you understand? Our God is not confined to a geographical location, and he's not confined to a building. Our God spoke to Abraham. He appeared to Abraham not in Israel, in Ur of the Chaldees, in Mesopotamia. He appeared to him there. He's not the God of just Israel who only shows up in the land of Israel, nor is he the God who only shows up in the temple. You have a very small view of God. That's what he's telling them. And that's not how God has behaved throughout history. And he does so with Abraham. But continuing to follow his logic. So verse 3. In verse 2, God appears to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia before he lived in Haran. So to go back to the picture, he appeared to him there before he lived up there. Fair enough. There's more to be said there. I just want you to see what he's going. Verse 3. And God said to him, Go out from the land of your kindred, or go out from the land and from your kindred, and go into the land that I will show you. So while Abraham was in Ur of Chaldees, in Mesopotamia, God spoke to him, and he's told him two things. Go from here and go to a land that I will show you. Go to Canaan. Leave your kindred behind. What did Abraham do? Good news. He tells us what he did. Look at verse 4, if I can find it in my notes. Let me get my notes caught up. In verse 4, then he went out from the land of the Chaldeans and lived in Haran. Well, now, wait a minute. I thought he was supposed to go to the promised land. He went to Haran. And after his father died, well, wait a minute. I thought he was supposed to leave his kindred behind. We know the story. Terah went with him, and Lot went with him. Here's the point. The father of the faithful was not always perfectly faithful. And that's what he wanted the Sanhedrin to understand. You pride yourselves in this great faithfulness. You're not that faithful. In fact, the nation of Israel has a history of unfaithfulness. Let's start with the father of the faithful. Even he had moments where he was not perfectly obedient and he was not perfectly faithful. And that's what he wanted the Sanhedrin to hear. Now, let's be honest. Do you think the Sanhedrin want to hear about the warts? No, not at all. Do you think they know these things to be true so far? Absolutely, they know them to be true. He's not telling them anything they don't know. He's telling them things they wish not to think about. And he's reminding them, Abraham was not as faithful as you pretend, and neither are you. Back to verse 4. So he went out from the land of the Chaldeans. He lived in Haran. After Terah, his father, died, God removed him there into this land in which we are now living. Fair enough. So we were here. Let me get you a slide. We were here. He was there. He moved to Haran. Ultimately, Terah died in Haran. And finally, he moved to the promised land. Fair enough. That's his point. So there he is in the promised land, verse 5. Yet he, that's Yahweh, that's God, gave him, that's Abraham, no inheritance in it, in the promised land, not even a foot length. So how much land was he? He was promised all the land, but how much did he get? Nothing. That's his point. Not even a foot's length, but the promise to give it to him as a possession and to his offspring after him, although he had no children. Okay, now you cannot think of a more audacious promise than this. Listen, Yahweh appears to Abram. I'm going to give you all of that land over there and to your descendants. And Abram says, well, who else have you told about this? Nobody. Do you realize I don't have any descendants yet? Yeah, I'm fully aware of that. And all the land is yours and your descendants. And here's a promise that must be received by faith. We cannot imagine how audacious this promise is. A man who is initially living in Ur, who ultimately moves to Haran, who God is giving these amazing promises to. And let's get to the point. Abraham was not instantly obedient. It turns out faith is a muscle that has to be worked, even in our life. And we're not ready for the big challenges in life until we've learned to walk with God in the little details of our life. That's the nature of faith. Abraham did not initially obey God. Now, he would become the father of the faithful. But Stephen is just reminding the Sanhedrin of the warts in Abraham's life. Verse 6. And God spoke to this effect. So imagine this promise. You're Abraham. You have no kids. You've been promised this land over there and your children, although you have no kids. And God makes another promise. God's not done making promises. Verse 6. And God says to this effect, that your offspring would be, that you don't have, by the way, would be sojourners in a land belonging to others, who would enslave them and afflict them for 400 years. Wow, what a promise there in verse 6. Okay, I promise you all this land, even though you're over here with no land. You don't even have as much as a foot's breadth. Oh, and by the way, I promise it to all your descendants, although you have no descendants. Oh, and by the way, I promise that your descendants are going to be sojourners in the land that doesn't belong to them, and they're going to be enslaved for 400 years. Those were the promises that came to Yahweh, from Yahweh to Abram. Verse 7. But I will judge the nation they serve, said God, and after that they shall come out and worship me in this place. So his point being, Ultimately, I'm going to bring judgment upon the nation, and you're going to come and worship me here. In fact, the Genesis 15 account. Yahweh said to Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. Again, Stephen has a profound understanding of all this. He's quoting this to them. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterwards they shall come out with great possessions. That is indeed what happened. Stephen is reminding them of everything that happened because he's driving to a point. And he reminds them that everything that happened with the nation of Israel, everything that's gone down with them, are all fulfilling the promises of God, exactly what God has promised. They would come out ultimately and worship God in the promised land, which is exactly what happened after 40 years of wilderness wandering because of their sin. We'll leave that off the table for a moment. Verse 8. And he, Yahweh, gave him, Abraham, the covenant of circumcision. And so Abraham became the father of Isaac and circumcised him on the 8th day. Isaac became the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of the 12 patriarchs. Now, what he just did, he's done talking about Abraham. He's made his point. His point is, God spoke to Abraham, not in Israel, in Ur. God spoke to Abraham, not in Israel, but in Haran. God didn't need a temple to present himself to Abraham. It didn't even exist yet. That's the God we serve, Sanhedrin. And so he's done now with his points about Abraham, and he's going to now transition to the second man he wants to talk about, and that is a man named Joseph. So he quickly goes over and he says, Abraham was circumcised, entering to the covenant. Isaac is born, Isaac is circumcised. Jacob is born, Jacob is circumcised. Jacob has the 12 patriarchs, the 12 sons, the 12 tribes of Israel. They're all circumcised because he's getting to Joseph. So he takes a whole lot of history and just compounds it in a sentence because he wants to go talk about Joseph. But all of this has happened exactly like the scriptures say. Indeed, the circumcision was given to Abraham. Indeed, they do circumcise on the 8th day. All of that is exactly what has happened. There's no argument from the Sanhedrin, and they probably barely only catch where he's going right now. Any questions before we, James, before we advance the story?
So, how did his response here kind of clarify or contradict that he blasphemed Abraham? What point did he say in this Abraham part that refutes or defends himself?
So what's interesting, James, and so I'll answer this at two levels. He was never accused of blaspheming against Abraham. He was accused of blaspheming against Moses. That's coming. So that's coming. But he never tries to directly, unlike Rich, I would be defending myself. He does not. He takes them to the nation, the history of the nation of Israel, and says, you don't see the larger issue. Israel has a pattern. The pattern is initial disobedience to God's way and only later acceptance. He's going to use that argument with Moses. He's going to use that argument with Joseph. We're about to see it with Joseph. That's the next character on the scene. His point is, you're missing the point. You think that you're so obedient, you're actually, by rejecting Jesus, doing what the nation of Israel has always done. So you'll watch it develop. But again, he never directly defends himself, but we'll make observations at the end. Anything else? Thank you for that question, James. Yes, Rich.
The God of Mesopotamia, the God of Egypt, is the focus of Stephen. And there's so much investment in both the promised land and in the physical temple that is the core of Pharisaical belief, Sadducean belief. And this is Stephen saying, listen, God didn't speak from the promised land to Abraham. He spoke to Abraham where Abraham was.
Amen.
And on and on. And that you are not to worship the temple of God, you're to worship the God of the temple. And this is a brilliant way of looking at the Gentiles and having them take their rightful place in the kingdom of heaven. And as you say, Stephen is a deacon. Stephen is not chosen by God to speak his word. He's chosen by those chosen by God. invested with the gift of the Spirit, and he shares that word with us.
An amazing logic. Completely unfounded. I think I said it in your notes. It's almost like the Jews had made the temple a charm, like a lucky charm. And Stephen's like, you're missing the point. God doesn't need the temple. Was it a blessing to have the temple? Of course. But God doesn't need the temple. That's the whole part they're missing. Verse 9. And the patriarchs, so we talked about Abraham, we jumped over Isaac, we jumped over Jacob, we jumped over all the 11 brothers to get to Joseph. That's his next stop. His next stop for the Sanhedrin is Joseph. And the patriarchs, jealous of Joseph, sold him into Egypt, but God was with him and rescued him out of all his afflictions and gave him favor and wisdom before Pharaoh, king of Egypt, who made him ruler over Egypt and over all his household. So let this unpack as he's standing before them. He brings up Joseph and he says, let me tell you what really happened. Joseph was sold into slavery because his brothers were jealous. Joseph had told them a dream that God had given him, 2 dreams actually. And in hearing those dreams that he was going to be elevated above him, it gave the appearance that God had picked him to be a ruler over them. And it moved them with jealousy. They became filled with jealousy for their brother, who they should love with all their heart. And to respond to that, they sold him into slavery. And here's what he's saying. Don't miss the lead. This is exactly what's going down with Jesus. In fact, look at what he said. Luke recorded this in Acts 5. The high priest rose up, that's Caiaphas, and all who were with him, that is of the party of the Sadducees, and they were filled with jealousy. You see what he's saying to them is you're doing exactly what Joseph's brother did to him for the exact same reason. You are filled with jealousy. You're afraid God's done something that's stealing out of your rice bowl. And you're missing the point that God has brought you a leader and a deliverer. He has brought you a Lord and a Christ. And that's Stephen's point as he addresses the Sanhedrin. You have completely missed it, and you're simply doing what the nation of Israel routinely does. Notice, though, to go back to verse 10, not only was God with Joseph, God rescued Joseph out of his afflictions. God gave Joseph in Egypt favor and wisdom before Pharaoh. You remember Joseph interpreted Pharaoh's 2 dreams. And after Pharaoh heard the interpretation, Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves at your command. Only in regards to the throne will I be greater than you. Pharaoh elevated the slave Joseph to the second most powerful man in Egypt, and the one who was doing it was God. It was God who gave him favor. It wasn't that Joseph was a smart guy. It was God that gave him the interpretation to the dreams. And that's what was responding. Now, as you think about this, as you think about God taking Joseph and making him leader and deliverer, even though his brothers had rejected that, that's exactly what's going down with Jesus. Look at how Peter describes it. Acts 2. Let all the house of Israel know, therefore, certain, that God has made him, the one you've rejected, both Kyrios and Christos, both Lord and Christ. This is Jesus whom you crucified. Here's his point as it relates to Joseph. You're doing what you did with Joseph. What the nation of Israel did with Joseph, here you go doing it. Or as Peter said it in Acts 5, God has exalted him, Jesus, at his right hand as leader and savior, as ruler and deliverer, exactly like he did with Joseph. That's his point here. As he lays this out before the Sanhedrin, this would strike a chord, hopefully that they heard. You're doing what the nation of Israel did to Joseph. You're repeating the same sin with Jesus. That brings us to verse 11. Continuing on the story of Joseph, there came a famine throughout all of Egypt and Canaan, and great afflictions. Our fathers could find no food, but when Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt, he sent out our fathers on the first visit. Now, he's covering a lot of territory in these sentences, right? We just did our study through Genesis, 62 weeks, I think. You remember all these details, right? You remember the 7 years of plenty. You remember Joseph building the barns and the storehouses and collecting the food. Well, he leaves all that out. He just sort of encapsulates it and says there's this great famine. Indeed, there was 7 years of it, but there was food in Egypt only that Joseph had. And ultimately, Jacob in verse 12 hears that there's grain in Egypt, and he sends our fathers on the first visit. Now, let's be honest, he's covering a lot of territory there. It wasn't all of them. Number one, at that point in the story, Joseph was believed to be dead, eaten by an animal, and Benjamin was the only other son left that he loved with all his heart, so he didn't send him. So the 10 actually went. But guess what? The Sanhedrin know the story, and Stephen's covering enough that they get it. And that brings us to verse 13. The second visit, okay, so we had the first visit. They went up there. If you remember the story, Joseph, as he's in his Egyptian garb, he looks like the second most powerful man in Egypt because he is. And he accuses them of coming to spy out the land. He said, you're here to spy out the land. This is why you're here. They give him the whole story. They have another brother. And he said, I'll tell you what, I don't believe you. You're a liar. And he throws all of them in jail for 3 days. Lock and key for 3 days. Then he goes back the third day and says, okay, I'll tell you what. If this is true, I'll let you all go. I'll keep Simeon, and you all can go back and bring your younger brother back. So he releases them all with the exception of Simeon. They all go back to Jacob, and they tell Jacob the story. And what does Jacob say about sending Benjamin to Egypt? Ain't gonna happen. No way. I'm not losing Benjamin. Ain't gonna happen. But what happens? They run out of food. You know, a hungry belly will change your mind. And sure enough, it does with Jacob. And he sends Benjamin. Now, again, he's covering a lot of territory. You remember the story. Benjamin comes. They have the big feast. They sell them more grain and they leave. But what is Benjamin carrying in his bag that he doesn't know anything about? His silver chalice. Remember, they let him get out. He sends his servant. Benjamin has the chalice. He's accused of stealing it. He goes back. But ultimately, to go to our brother's point, Joseph in verse 13 makes himself known to his brothers. You remember it. And Joseph's family becomes known to Pharaoh. You remember all the weeping. Pharaoh heard about it. And ultimately, when the report was heard in Pharaoh's house, Joseph's brothers had come. It pleased the Pharaoh and his servants. Stephen is just walking them through the history they wouldn't disagree with. He skips over a lot of stuff that's not relevant to the points he's making, and ultimately gets to verse 14. And Joseph sent and summoned Jacob his father and all the kindred, 75 persons in all. That is exactly what happened. Remember the story. He sent the wagons to pick up everyone. They showed up and told Jacob the story. Your son's still alive. He didn't believe them. But the wagons kept pulling up from Egypt in their front yard to pick up the entire family and move them. Do you know why? Because God was making the man they rejected both ruler and deliverer in spite of their rejection. That's the point. Now here, what's interesting, this is a quote from the fact about 75, is a quote from Genesis 46:27 in the Septuagint. It reminds us that Stephen is indeed a Greek speaker, he's a Hellenist, and he's using the Septuagint in all of his quotes. And that brings us to verse 15. And Jacob went down into Egypt, and he died, he and our fathers, and they were carried back to Shechem and laid in the tomb that Abraham had bought for a sum of silver from the sons of Hamor in Shechem. So let's unpack this. Jacob goes down to Egypt. We know the story. He rides the wagons into Egypt. He stays in Egypt. He meets the Pharaoh. He ultimately dies in Egypt. You remember they have a big funeral procession for Jacob. Ultimately, they buried Jacob in the cave of Machpelah. We'll talk more about that in a second. And then in verse 16, they were carried back. That's likely the other patriarchs, and laid in the tomb that Abraham bought for a sum of silver from the sons of Hamor in Shechem. Okay, let's pause. There's a point here I want you to see. I don't have the whole answer for you. I'll just tell you what people believe. As you look at verse 16, you read about how they carried back to Shechem. They laid in the tomb the patriarchs, in a tomb that Abraham bought for a sum of silver that he purchased from the sons of Hamor in Shechem. That should catch your attention because it is not in complete alignment with the Genesis account of this. Let me show you. Jacob came safely to the city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, on his way to Padan Aram, and he camped before the city. And from the sons of Hamor, Shechem's father, he bought for 100 pieces of silver of money the piece of land on which he pitched his tent. We were never told that, we were always told that this piece of property was bought by Jacob, not by Abraham. But it appears Abraham also bought a piece of property. We just didn't know about it. Now, the theologians hold two positions. Number one, Abraham had this purchase that just wasn't recorded in Genesis, but part of Israel's history, or that what's happening here is Stephen is telescoping these two events into one. I don't know what the right answer is, but I want you to understand, I'm certain Stephen was right, even though it's lost to history exactly what Abraham did. He definitely bought something there in Shechem. We know he built an altar in Shechem. We know he was in Shechem. And here Stephen is saying he bought this piece of land, where the only account we get of it being bought of a piece of land is in Jacob in Genesis 33. But I have no doubt that somehow Abraham bought one or the same one as well. We've lost the details to time. And that brings us to verse 17. Okay, so the nation of Israel is in Egypt. The nation of Israel is going to be Egyptian bondage for 400 years. Verse 17. But as the time of the promise drew near, which God had granted to Abraham, the people increased and multiplied in Egypt. Okay, so Abraham had been given the promise, 400 years, your descendants are going to be slaves in Egypt, and the time is getting close. As it starts to get close, the people start to multiply in Egypt, Stephen says. Fair enough, no problem. In fact, we're reminded this is where Abraham was told it would be 400 years. So what's happening is exactly what happened. Verse 18. So the people are multiplying until there arose over Egypt another king who did not know Joseph. Okay, so let's pause. Again, he's quoting the Septuagint. This is exactly what happened. Oh, I must have skipped it. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Again, Stephen is walking them through the history of what's going on. They're multiplying greatly, and all of a sudden, a Pharaoh arises who does not know Joseph. That's precisely what happened. This king, we're told, dealt treacherously with our race. He dealt shrewdly with the Israelites. He forced their fathers to expose their infants so that they would die. This is precisely what's recorded in Exodus. First, we're told, they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. That is precisely what happened. This Pharaoh rose up who did not know Joseph, and the relationship between Egypt and Israel changed. And they became servants, and they were treated ruthlessly. They were treated as slaves, even though Joseph had saved Egypt. Joseph is the one who saved Egypt, but a Pharaoh rises up that doesn't know any of the exploits of Joseph. And he's worried about the population explosion of these Israelites. He's worried about they might join with the enemies of Egypt in a fight, and so he decides to ruthlessly treat them. Further, the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah, the other Puah, when you serve as midwife on the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it's a son, you are to kill him. And if it's a daughter, she shall live. He gives the command that every male child, when the Hebrew midwives show up, is to be killed right there in the process of birth. But because Shiphrah and Puah are God-fearing women, they won't do it. Pharaoh brings them in and says, why aren't you killing the boys like I told you? And they give this story. Well, these Hebrew women are more lively than the Egyptian women, and they have the babies before we can ever get there, Mr. Pharaoh, so there's just nothing we can do. And so Pharaoh gives another command. And Pharaoh commands all his people, every son that is born to the Hebrews, you shall cast into the Nile. You shall expose them, but you shall let every daughter live. You see what's going on now. The Pharaoh is opposed to any additional male children. He tried to have them executed through the midwives. That didn't work. He's now had the whole nation. If you see them, throw them in the Nile. They are not to live. Now, I do want to say something about Exodus while I'm here. When we finish the book of Acts, I would love to go back to the Old Testament and do Exodus. We just finished Genesis, 2 months ago, a little over 2 months ago. In Exodus, we have so much to look at. We have the real location of Mount Sinai and the evidence that supports it to look at. We have the crossing of the Red Sea and the evidence that supports it to look at. We have the tent tabernacle and all the beautiful pictures of the Lord Jesus Christ contained in that building, in that tent building. So hopefully as you guys vote for wherever we're going next in the Old Testament, please consider Exodus. Just a shameless plug on my part. I'm not going to vote, but I would give a shameless plug. Okay, forgive me, I had to do that. Verse 20. It's at this time, at this perilous time, at this horrific time, at this time when they were commanded to kill their babies, when the Egyptians were commanded to throw their babies in the water. It was at this time that Moses, James, was born. Look at what he calls him. Moses was beautiful in God's sight. That's exactly, again, a quote from the Septuagint. And he was brought up for 3 months in his father's house. So they hid him out for 3 months. They tried to keep him for 3 months. In fact, Moses' parents show up in the Hall of Faith. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw that the child was, there it is again, beautiful. They saw something unique and special about this child. They didn't expose him. They didn't throw him in the Nile. They rather secretly raised him because they were not afraid of the king's edict. But unfortunately, the time would come when they would have to expose him. The time would come when they would have to let him go. But verse 20, brought up in his father's house for 3 months. Verse 21. And when he was exposed, Pharaoh's daughter adopted him and brought him up as her own son. So what ultimately happened is the day came when they could not hide him any longer. And so we read this in Exodus. When she, Moses' mother Jochebed, could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in the basket and she placed Moses among the reeds. She didn't cast him in the Nile, but let's be honest, I'm not sure what the life expectancy is of a child in a floating basket in the Nile. Pretty low, except this is God's man who he's going to raise to be the deliverer and the leader of Israel. And when that's the case, the odds of success are extremely high. But understand what his mother did after unable to hide him any longer. She put him in the basket. Ultimately, Pharaoh's daughter, as fate would have it, or the sovereignty of God would have it, comes down to bathe. And she happens to see this little basket, and she directs one of her servant girls to go get the basket. And we read this. And when she, Pharaoh's daughter, opened the little basket, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying, as almost if on cue. She took pity on him and said, this is one of the Hebrew children. To go back to our story, she raised him up as her own child. But we're passing over a lot of details still. We're passing over the fact that his mom actually raised him for the first part of his life and then gave him back to Pharaoh. We're passing over all that, but that's not Stephen's point. And he gets us to verse 22. So he's brought up for 3 months in his father's house. He's exposed. Pharaoh's daughter adopts him, brings him up as her own son. We leave out a lot there, but ultimately that's what's happened. Verse 22. And Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. He was mighty in words and deeds. Here's a man with natural ability. Here's a man with God-given ability. And here's a man who is raised up in the most prestigious university at the time, Egyptian University. He is trained he's trained in the history, astronomy, mathematics, science, medicine. He is trained with the best knowledge Egypt has to offer. That's the man that God has picked. That's how God has prepared this man to be the leader and deliverer of the nation that is in bondage in Egypt for 400 years. That's where Stephen is in the story. Any questions so far? Yes, and I don't know your name, sir, but thank you for joining us today, and I'd love to meet you after class.
Yes, just a quick question. It says he's powerful in speech and action. Doesn't Moses use just the opposite as an excuse to say, hey, I stutter and I can't speak well?
I can't speak well. But Stephen said, but he was a man of great understanding. He was a man of great learning.
Right, right.
So though he stuttered, he was a man of profound knowledge in speech.
And I do see as it seems to build, doesn't it seem like, I can only imagine how they know all these in great detail and they're just getting more angry as time goes on because they're hearing this story from a Gentile who really has no training in their eyes. And they just see this over and over and like, who are you trying to school me? As opposed to somehow seeing the light. It's just they're going in the, I think, we see in the other direction. So it's just kind of, sometimes we think, well, how can you tell me that? You don't have any credential.
And so that's been the theme with these apostles. Who do you think you are? Coming up here on the Temple Mount and declaring all this stuff. You've not been raised up in any rabbinic tradition. Where are you coming from? You're nothing but Galilean fishermen. Who do you think you are? And now here's this Hellenist Jew who is schooling them on the things they know by pointing out the things they've willfully forgotten. And you're exactly right. They started out the equation angry, and he's going to work them up to an absolute boil. But they're missing the point. And here's the point, so let me give it to you so we don't miss it. The nation of Israel had a history of rejecting what God was doing and later receiving it. That's what they did with Joseph. That's what they did with Moses. We're going to see it develop. And what Stephen is telling the Sanhedrin is it's not too late. You have rejected, but there's still time you can receive. You're on the wrong end of the equation, but you can get on the right end. God is doing something amazing here. You've made a mistake in your judgment, but you can change ships. But they'll have nothing to do with that. Say that again? Right, that's right. Oh, Lottie. Nope, Roy.
Isn't it interesting? Moses was the stepson of Pharaoh with greatness. He was the leader that led the Jews out. But neither Egypt or Israel ever built a monument to Moses' greatness.
They did not. No, they did not. Okay, so Moses is instructed, verse 22. Oh, another question? Okay. Verse 22, in all mighty words and deeds, verse 23. Now, when he was 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brothers, the children of Israel. So at 40, now he likely knows this whole time he's Hebrew. His mom raised him early on. She likely explained to him the roots of the fact that he's a Hebrew, where he came from, why he's here. At 40, it comes into his heart. Now, we're not explained how it came into his heart, but we would suspect that who brought it into his heart? We suspect the Lord brought it into his heart. The Lord placed it into his heart to go visit his brothers, his fellow countrymen, the ones who were in slavery, in this bitter slavery by now, to see how they're doing. So this man, Moses, with it placed in his heart, verse 24, goes to visit his brothers. And seeing one of them being wronged, he defended the oppressed man and avenged the oppressed man by striking down the Egyptian. For he supposed, listen to this, Moses supposed, according to Stephen, that his brothers would understand that God was giving them salvation by his hand, but they did not understand. Did you hear what Stephen said? It had come into Moses' heart to deliver. God had put it in his heart and mind that he was going to be involved in deliverance of the Israelites out of Egypt. He stepped in, but they did not understand. Worst case, let's keep reading because it gets better. In fact, here's the account in Exodus. I'll just give it to you. One day when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens and saw that an Egyptian was beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. That is exactly what Stephen is talking about, supposing that they understood that he was going to be their deliverer. And that brings us to verse 26. And on the following day, he appeared to them as they were quarreling, and he tried to reconcile them, saying, "Men, you are brothers. Why do you wrong each other?" So he came back the next day. Two men are fighting. He steps in and says, "Look, why are you fighting with one another? We're not the enemy here." And look what happens in verse 27. But the man who was wronging his neighbor thrust him aside. "Who made you a ruler and a judge? Do you want to kill me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday?" He quickly thrust him aside and said, "You're not the ruler and judge here. Who made you the ruler and judge?" Not understanding who had made him the ruler and judge. God had. God had made him the ruler and deliverer. He missed it completely. The nation of Israel rejects once again God's ordained ruler and God's ordained deliverer and thrust him aside. And then he asked him that rhetorical question: do you plan to kill me like you killed the Egyptian yesterday? And at that retort, the guy Moses recognized, this is going to get to Pharaoh, and he fled. He fled Egypt. He ran away. Verse 29. At this retort, Moses fled and became an exile in the land of Midian, where he became the father of 2 sons. So he fled from Egypt across the Sinai Peninsula to Midian, to what we call Saudi Arabia. So just sort of tuck that away, because that's going to come back around in a second. But 40 years in Egypt, he has now fled from Egypt, fled from Pharaoh's influence. He is all the way now in Midian. That's Stephen's point. Any questions? Okay, perfect. Verse 30. Now, when 40 more years had passed, so we had 40 years in Egypt. When 40 more years had passed, an angel appeared to Moses in the wilderness of Mount Sinai in the flame of a bush. Okay, so Moses stepped in to defend. This whole thing went up sideways. He flees Egypt. That was at year 40. He's now in Midian for 40 more years. And at 80, this angel of the Lord appears to him in the wilderness of Mount Sinai. Pause. Where did Moses flee to? Midian. Where did he see the angel encounter? According to this verse, it was in the wilderness of Mount Sinai. I hope you see the obvious implication that Mount Sinai is located where? In Midian. That's the point. Now, if you're thinking, Rich, I have never heard that, and that is almost crazy talk. I know that Mount Sinai is in the Sinai Peninsula, and I don't know what you're talking about. I'm going to take you to an allegory that Paul gives the church. If I can get there, that Paul gives the church in Galatians chapter 4. Here's what he says. He's building this big allegory, and he comes to this. He says, Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, in Midian, not in the Sinai Peninsula. Okay, shameless plug, and I'm going to leave it alone. Should we choose to go back to Exodus, I will bring you compelling evidence that we now know exactly where Mount Sinai is. It is indeed in Midian. It is not in the Sinai Peninsula. By the way, the Sinai Peninsula was under Egyptian control at this time. And the Red Sea that they crossed was more than likely the Gulf of Aqaba. And not only that, we're likely fairly certain we know where they crossed, because it could only be one place because of the topography of the ocean floor. It has to be a place when you peel back the water, they're not going to be sludging down mud into a mud basin and then crawling out of a mud wall. It needs to be a deep sand, flat area that they're going to walk through once you peel back all the water. I would submit it to you, we found all these things now. And so should we touch Exodus, we will look at all that, but I'll get back to our lesson. Okay, so sorry about that. I just had to do that. So verse 31, when Moses saw that burning bush, he was amazed at the sight. He drew near to look, and there came out from that the voice of the Lord, saying, I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham and of Isaac and of Jacob. And Moses trembled and did not dare look. So picture what Stephen's explaining. Moses sees this bush burning. He goes over there, he turns and goes to see what's going on. He sees this bush burning, not being consumed. He's rather amazed by the sight. And then a voice comes out that says, I'm the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac. And Moses, according to Stephen, trembled and would not even look on the bush. Let's look at the account. And the Lord saw that that's Moses, turned aside to see. God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. He said, here I am. Then he said, do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. You see, Stephen has a profound understanding of exactly what's been happening with the nation of Israel. He's quoting it back to the Sanhedrin. He's walking them through their own history. Verse 33. And the Lord said to him, take off the sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. We just read that. I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt. I've heard their groaning. I've come down to deliver them. And now come, I send you to Egypt. Okay, so let's walk through this. Take off your sandals. You're in the very manifest presence of the holiness of God. The holy God has showed up on earth. You're in his presence. That's point number one. Then he tells him, I've seen the affliction of my people. I've seen what's happening. I've heard the groanings of my people. And I've come down to deliver them. Now let that sink in. What's it going to look like when Yahweh comes down? Is he bringing a chariot, Rich? What's he coming down in? He's coming down to deliver them, but look at the next thing Yahweh says to Moses. Oh, I'm sorry. Lee J.
Why will Stephen say he saw the angel instead of saying God?
So even in the Genesis account, it's called an angel. Keep in mind, in the Old Testament, many times Yahweh is referred to as the angel of the Lord. He's the angel of the covenant. That word, both in the Hebrew and the Greek, means messenger. He's the messenger of the covenant. And then once he starts talking, he's identified as God. And hopefully that answers your question pretty straightforward. So here we go. Take off your sandals. You've seen the affliction. I've seen their groaning. I've come to deliver them. Point number 5. And I'm sending you. By way of implication, I intend to deliver the nation of Israel out of Egypt by you. I have come down in the sense that I'm calling you to do a work that I prepared you for. Now go and do that work. When God has a work to do, he rarely does it himself. Most of the time, he chooses one of us to do that work. If we go to our pastor's sermon from last week, before we go to Rich's point, he has a lot of tools in the toolbox. He has a lot of tools in the toolbox, but he generally picks one that is what? Close and clean. Moses is the tool for this job.
As Rich has said multiple times, Stephen is inordinately selective
Absolutely.
about the things that he tells us. So I think that really emphasizes the fact that he wants to share with us that you can find holy ground outside of Israel, outside of Jerusalem, and most importantly, outside the temple, that he shares that bit of information when he skips so many other things and so many other people. So he wants to tell us about holy ground. He wants to tell us that God coming to us consecrates that ground and makes it holy.
Amen. And he wants to remind the Sanhedrin, which is, like you said, reminding us, that all of this happened outside of the promised land. All of this happened before a temple was ever born. Our God was never limited by geography or by a building. Kristen.
Okay, so with Moses being nervous to go back when God commands him to go back, backing back up to verse 25, where Stephen says he supposed that his brothers would understand that God was sending. Do we have a cross-reference from Moses himself where he confirms that he felt like God had chosen him for something special?
This is how the writer of Hebrews explains it. Now, you let me know if this answers your question. This is coming from Hebrews 11, the Hall of Faith. Here's what it says. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking at the reward. By faith, he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of a king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover, the sprinkled blood, so that the destroyer of firstborn might not touch him. By faith, the people crossed the Red Sea as on dry land, but the Egyptians, when they attempted to do the same, were drowned. It pictures a man in the early verses who saw two possible camps: the camp of Egypt, the life of sin, or the camp being connected with the nation of Israel, those who were suffering reproach. And he saw being in that camp and suffering a reproach similar to the reproach that Jesus Christ himself suffered as the one he would choose. So, Kristen, that's the best I got. Absolutely. But now I have no idea where I'm at. So let me see if I can get us back to somewhere close to where I was. Okay, so verse 35, excuse me. We there yet? No, no more. Verse 35. This Moses whom they rejected, saying, who made you a ruler and a judge? They had thrust him out. Who made you ruler and who made you deliverer? This man God sent as both ruler and redeemer by the hand of the angel who appeared to him in the bush. Who made you the ruler and the redeemer? The nation thrust him away. God did it anyway. God wasn't relying on them. And he's wanting the Sanhedrin to see the nation of Israel does this over and over and over again. God raises up a ruler and a deliverer, and you thrust him away. The good news is, over and over again, we've seen that the nation changes their mind for a large part. And we've watched the nation change their mind with Jesus. And to go to Stephen's point, before the Sanhedrin, it's not too late to change your mind. That's his point. Verse 36. This man led them out, this man Moses, out of Egypt, performing wonders and signs in Egypt and at the Red Sea and in the wilderness for 40 years. And I would add, think of all the miracles and signs and wonders they have seen in the Messiah. You get the point. His closing point, where we end him in his sermon today, is you are doing what the nation of Israel has always done. Stop it. Okay, so 8 observations. We'll end here, and I'll be quick, Laurel. 8 observations. Clearly, Stephen has a high regard for the law of God. I hope you've seen that. Clearly, he has a high regard for Moses. He's not in any way blaspheming Moses. Point number 3, Abraham was not in Israel, nor did he have the temple when God appeared to him. Joseph was not in Israel, nor did he have access to the temple when God was with him. Moses was not in Israel, nor did he have access to the temple when God sent him. The Sanhedrin have to be seeing these lines. Israel's sons rejected Joseph, the man God sent as both deliverer and ruler. Do you know what God did? Made him ruler and deliverer anyway. The nation of Israel rejected Moses, the man God sent to be both leader and deliverer. And do you know what God did? Made him the leader and deliverer anyway. And that's the message. It's the message of grace. To the Sanhedrin, the message so far, you've done this. You're in the wrong. You're on the wrong side of the equation. But like the other 20,000 who have professed faith approximately by this time, it's not too late to change your position, recognizing that God, Yahweh, has sent Jesus to be both Lord and Christ. And I think we're out of time, Laurel. We're out of time. We have to pray. I have to pray us out the door. Let's pray.